Kids and young people who suffer a head knock may need to be sidelined for up to a month. A world-first study suggests concussion in young sports people can increase their future risk of injury by 50%. It comes ahead of the Australian Senate's report into concussion injuries and follows the AFL's announcement for a $25 million study into the long-term effects of concussions and head knocks. Joining me now live is lead researcher at the University of South Australia, Dr. Hunter Bennett. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Good to see you. So why the need for a longer recovery time then for young sports people?
Yeah, thank you. So there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that individuals under the age of 18 can take a little bit longer to recover than sort of the 12-day minimum that is currently enforced in a lot of sporting contexts. That doesn't mean that everyone takes longer than 12 days to recover, but there is some evidence to suggest that on average, some players will take that long. That may not mean that we need a longer time period enforced, but it could be a viable option to potentially make sure players are coming back to sport after a concussion recovered.
So then take us through the current guidelines. So it's 12 days, and is that for the younger athletes who do suffer head trauma?
So the 12-day minimum is pretty much enforced across sort of all Australian rules football codes, so AFL, SANFL, whether that's youth, women's, men's competitions. So it is just a minimum time period that an athlete can return after a concussion. It's sort of like the minimum level. They just cannot return prior to that. In a lot of sort of elite sporting contexts where they have maybe really high quality medical staff and full-time medical staff, it's not uncommon for players to take longer than that 12-day minimum just because they are sort of assessed really thoroughly and they wait until full recovery has occurred. But in some sort of, say, more youth football settings where maybe they don't have access to those medical staff, it seems to be a little bit more common to maybe return after that 12-day minimum just because they don't get access to such thorough testing.
This is a world-first study that you and the team have done. Take us through it and take us through how you came to this conclusion.
Yeah, so we have sort of been working and been fortunate enough to work with the South Australian National Football League and their under-18s program. So they, as an organisation, are quite invested in player welfare and really sort of helpful and facilitate this sort of research. So essentially what we've done is we've tracked injuries over the last 7 years. And what we found is that if you look at those players who come back from any injury and return to play, they're about 50% more likely to get injured than someone who hasn't had an injury before. That sort of makes sense when you look at soft tissue injuries, because when there's tissue damage, the tissue might be weakened, it may not recover that well, and then they're more likely to get injured as a result. Interestingly, what we found is that when players return after a concussion, they see that same increase in injury risk, despite not having the same sort of tissue damage. So it does imply that there's maybe something going on with concussion, whether it's sort of residual effects like impairments in balance or reaction time, that are lasting maybe a little bit longer, and they could theoretically be improving or increasing their risk of injury when they return to play.
Okay, so all it takes then is possibly one concussion. How do you gauge the risk overall? Is one concussion enough, as you mentioned, or is it just more than that?
So it seems, based off of the research that we've done, that if you come back and return after a single concussion, then your risk of injury is increased. So it does just seem to take one, at least in this setting. We don't have the sort of resolution to examine whether multiple concussions increase that risk further, but it does seem to just be consistent that if you do experience a concussion and you come back, you're likely to experience some sort of increase in injury risk when you're compared to those athletes who have never had an injury before.
So extending the period then that a person is off, so you say about 4 weeks, what more needs to be done? Is it a case of testing people more thoroughly before these young sports people are then able to return to the field?
In my mind, that would be the sort of ideal scenario, is that these athletes get more thorough testing during their recovery period. So there's certain questionnaires that you can take that have shown associations with recovery times. You can do certain balance tests, performance testing even. Probably the one thing that is a bit of a barrier is that what you would hope to see after a concussion is that these measures need to be sort of returned back to baseline levels. So it does mean that you do have to have a baseline measure to base that off of. So obviously this testing protocol can be quite burdensome because you test all the players at the start of the season, despite the fact that, the vast majority of them probably won't get concussed, which can be a bit of a time burden and that sort of stuff. But in my mind, that would probably be the ideal approach to take.
Look, it's really fascinating research, and as we mentioned in the introduction, this sort of issue has become really front and centre of late. There's a real focus now on concussions and the long-term impacts of that. Why do you think suddenly now it's in the spotlight compared to what it has before?
I think it's starting to get noticed, I guess, or considered as a serious injury. So, if you think back, maybe 15, 20 years ago, it probably wasn't viewed in the same light as sort of other musculoskeletal injuries. But now, we know that there can sort of be some lasting effects on cognitive function, sort of decision-making ability, that sort of stuff. And I think just because of that, we're starting to see that it is a little bit more of a serious injury than once first thought, which that increased awareness is a fantastic thing. And now that that's sort of being brought forward and it's sort of in the limelight, it's obviously just getting a bit more interest as a result. And I think because there is also a lot of people who maybe have been concussed in the past and they didn't receive adequate treatment, that's probably another consideration as well.
Absolutely. Certainly an eye-opening research that you've done here. Dr. Hunter Bennett, good to speak with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.